Welcome everyone. So today's topic is about Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So this is just going to be a brief overview of the various stages of Piaget's cognitive development, and we're just going to go over the key aspects to each stage. Starting with this first stage, the sensorimotor stage. This stage ranges from 0 to 2 years old. The child has a sense, uses its senses, and interacts with the world around them. In this stage, what they develop is object permanence, as well stranger anxiety. The second stage, which is the preoperational stage, this lasts between 2 to 7 years old. This is where the use and the master of symbols comes into play and representations. So this can take form as pretend play for children. They will also master the concept of conservation of quality. Now, what does that mean? The conservation of quality is knowing that quality does not change regardless of the physical appearance. So, for example, you take a piece of Play-Doh and you roll it into a ball and you put it in front of a child. And you ask them, what you see here, I want you to keep in mind. And so then the researcher will then roll out the Play-Doh into a long, thin strand. And then shows it to the child and asks, which of the two has more mass? The thin, long strand, Play-Doh, or the big ball of Play-Doh? The child in the preoperational stage that has not mastered the conservation of quality will say, well, it has to be the long, thin one because it's longer, therefore there's probably more of it. However, the child that masters this in the stage will state that there is no change in the mass regardless of the manipulation of its physical appearance. The next point we want to emphasize is that children at this stage will be egocentric. What this means is that a child will only have a perceptual view of themselves. They don't take other views into consideration. For example, a child that is egocentric, if you ask them, who sits beside you at lunch on your left and right hand side, the child will say person A and person B. And then you ask who sits in front of you, and they will say, well, it's person C. And then if you ask them, okay, what about person C? Who sits beside them? Well, then this is where egocentrism will come into play. That child will say, well, it's person A and person B, of course. Now, this is not correct because that child is only seeing the perspective of her view, which is on her what is on her left and her right hand side must be also beside person C. So if that wasn't a good enough example for you, let's take this another example just to clarify everything. So a child will sometimes take a sheet or close their eyes with their hands, okay? And so they believe by closing their eyes that everyone around them sees what they see. So if their eyes is closed, everyone else can only see that their eyes are closed. So everyone else will see nothing as well. So that's egocentrism. The next thing about this stage is the centration concept. So centration is basically a good example is you have a bowl of ice cream And you have two bowls actually. You have a large bowl with ice cream in it, and then another bowl that is smaller in size but has just the same amount of ice cream that you put in the big bowl. So a child that has not mastered centration in this stage will say, so if you ask them, which bowl has more ice cream? The child that has not mastered the concept of centration will say, well, it's obviously it has to be the bigger bowl, because the bigger bowl means there's got to be more in it. So, however, a child that has mastered this concept of centration will say, well, no matter if it's a bigger bowl or not, they have the same amount of ice cream. So, centration only focuses on one aspect instead of the entire picture. So the next thing, whoops, that's not what we want. Okay. Sorry guys, just take me a minute. Okay, back to where we were. So now, we are at the concrete operational stage, and this lasts from about 7 to 11 years old. And this is where we have more complexity coming in. This is where these children can now perform mental operations. For example, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. However, you must know at this stage, they cannot do the reverse operations. They also master the concept of conservation. They master the concept of quantity. Now, this is a little different compared to the conservation of quality. So the conservation of quantity is that the quantity does not change regardless of its appearance. So let's do a good example just to make it clear. So we have a row of, let's say, quarters, okay? We have 3 quarters in one row. The second row also has the same amount of quarters, but they are going to be closer together, okay? And so, if you ask a child that has not mastered the conservation of quantity, they will say, so if you ask them, which row has more quarters? They will say, it is more likely 1. Why? Because the space into consideration makes it seem like there's more quarters when there are actually the same amount of quarters. Now, a child that has mastered this concept of conservation of quantity, they will say, well, there's the same amount of quarters in each row. So that is the concept of conservation of quantity. The next thing we want to point out is that the children at this stage have the ability to classify objects. So what I mean by that is now they can start putting objects into groups according to their characteristics. So for example, children have some toys. They have animals, they have cars, they have Barbies, they have a whole variety of toys. But now, at this stage, they have the ability to classify each of these toys. So, if you ask them to group them together, they will put the Barbies with the Barbies, the cars with the cars, and then the other toys in a more fashionable order. And the last thing to understand about this stage is that they understand relationships. So actually these two kind of go hand in hand. So they must understand relationships between objects in order to classify them. So that is the last portion of concrete operational. Now we will be talking about the formal operational stage, which is the very last stage of Piaget's theory. Now, the first thing we want to know is these people, or I should say the age that this happens is about 12 years and older. And the first thing we want to know is that they gain the ability to reason hypothetical situations. So if you give them a hypothetical situation, they should be able to come up with complex and more abstract reasoning to their answer. And that leads to abstract thinking, of course. This stage may be non-utilized in some cultures that do not that are lacking the resources in order to undergo this stage. What I mean by that is, if you have a child in a third world country and they had very little education to begin with, very little hypothetical reasoning skills, so they will not utilize this formal operational stage. They may have a little bit of the formal operational stage. However, as they get older, there may be pruning and this will be less utilized. And therefore, the children do not have a use for formal operational thinking if they don't have the resources in order to undergo this stage. And the last thing to point out is that the people that are in the stage have the ability for moral reasoning. So judgments behind what are moral and ethical reasonings to situations, such as, do they have the ability to define what is right and what is wrong based on their experiences. So those are the 4 stages of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. We went over the sensorimotor stage, the preoperational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. I hope this video helped you. Please like and subscribe.